Greetings and salutations, friends! I figured it was time for a short little break from Vrax, and also to let the Warhammer Fantasy guys know that I haven't completely forgotten about you. We'll be back to Vrax again next week with a couple of episodes, actually, but I figured a quick little break would be good, for me too. I love doing Vrax, and I'm quite proud of the end result, but oof, it is quite a lot of work. So today, we're going to do something a little bit fun. I'm going to tell you how to become a Chaos Champion in the Warhammer Fantasy universe, of course, so, you know, pinch of salt whether or not this will work in our world, but feel free to try, or, well, don't, because most of it will probably be illegal, but hey, details. So, how, in the world of Warhammer Fantasy, does one draw the attention of the Chaos Gods and their eventual blessing without, mind you, drawing too much of their attention, because that's not a good thing either, unless you fancy eternal spawnhood as some form of reward. Granted, you will be immortal and quite strong to boot, but you will also be about as nutty as squirrel poop. And in the minds of most people, that would probably be a rather bad trade-off. What one should instead aim for is to become a champion of the ruinous powers, and, should one prove even more worthy, potentially even the mantle of a demon prince. As ascending to that lofty position has all of the benefits of spawnhood, like prodigious strength and immortality, but very few of the drawbacks, like going crazy. As a demon prince, you will be allowed to retain your sanity, or at the very least as much of your sanity as is possible, being a monstrous demonic entity enslaved to an even more monstrous demonic entity. Now, at the end of the day, everything is relative. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before one can even begin to contemplate the possibility of becoming a demon prince, there is a very, very, very long and slippery road ahead of any hopeful candidates. And exactly how the road swings and swirls depends a lot on where you were born. If, for example, you were born in the harsh wilds of Norska, you are in all due likelihood going to be somewhat predisposed to this particular line of work. As in Norska, it is not only socially acceptable to try and become a champion of the ruinous powers, it is considered extraordinarily honourable, and those who manage to achieve this lofty feat will be remembered by their tribe for all time to come. Songs will be made, verses will be created, sagas will be written, etc., etc. And this holds true for all of the human servants of the ruinous powers, not just those in Norska. The hung Barbarians, for example. And yes, the hung. I'm gonna have to make a lore video on them sometime, and the title shall simply be The Hung Barbarian. It'd be beautiful. Get me a whole different audience. Anywho, returning back on track, if, however, you live in a more civilized corner of the planet, things are going to be a hell of a lot more complicated, so for the sake of simplicity, let us start amongst the Barbarians, shall we? As mentioned, it is entirely acceptable to try and become a champion of the ruinous powers in the various barbarian societies, but this does not mean that it is a common choice of profession, or even a particularly popular one. In fact, it is often forced upon people rather unwillingly, and this is due to the significant mortality rate amongst anyone who tries to embark upon this career path. One of the most common ways to begin might, for example, be to have been exiled from one's tribe, which essentially means that the poor bastard in question has to make it out in the wilderness entirely on his own, and if he were to attempt to rely on anyone from his old tribe, odds are they would simply just outright kill him. And considering the somewhat contentious nature of Norscan society, it's also extraordinarily unlikely that any other tribes would wish to take him in either. This means that being exiled is essentially a death sentence, and is mostly used precisely because of that, to punish the highest of crimes, but On occasion, some people are simply just too goddamn stubborn to lay down and die like a cooperative person would have. These often join roving warbands, in which they are usually killed, so that the other members of the warband can steal what little they have, or to advance on their own wiggly, chaosy career path. Assuming they don't die, they'll make their way slowly up the ranks, joining in the battle line, where they are also most likely going to be killed by a rivaling warband or in battle with some enemies of the ruinous powers. If he survives this as well, he may gain some form of status within the warband, becoming a minor leader, at which point he will also most likely be killed. Because, of course, the moment you gain anything in the way of stature, power, or possessions within the warband, you are suddenly a far more tempting target for all of the other people who want to take all of those things away from you. If one is to survive this step as well, then the next logical step would be a position closer to the warband's leader, perhaps a favoured aide, or favoured sorcerer perhaps, a martial champion even maybe. At this point, our Norscan exile is in an exalted position within the warband. Maybe he is the warlord's right-hand man, or his chief magi, or something along those lines. And at that point, he's also once again probably going to be killed. Except this time, the threat comes more from above than it does below, since if one has actually managed to get to this position, you're probably pretty good at protecting yourself. You're probably one of the best in the entire warband, in fact, which quite naturally means you're a threat to the boss man. And you probably know how chaos bosses handle uppity subordinates. I suspect you're probably beginning to see a pattern emerging. It is indeed quite dangerous to be a part of a chaos warband. Exceedingly so, in fact. And the simple reason for this is that quite literally everyone in it, with the possible exception of the slaves and the pack animals, all of them are there for the exact same reason as our Norscan exile. They are attempting to get noticed by the ruinous powers, the gods of chaos, and the best way of doing that is to carry out some grand feat, depending on the god in question you wish to attract. Some grand feat of arms for Khorne, some subtle plot of manipulation from Tzeentch, some great orgy of debauchery for Slaanesh, or simply having a particularly vile bout of diarrhea in the case of Nurgle. It is a remarkably competitive environment, in which any and all gains made by any individual is automatically considered to be at the detriment of basically everyone else. Because to achieve these great deeds, one needs resources, one needs position, one needs power. Whilst the Chaos Gods, being the fickle little cunts that they of course are, occasionally reward entirely random shit. That example with Nurgle was not actually a joke. One could possibly, conceivably, be rewarded for a particularly vile bout of diarrhea. However, if one is a mere footman of chaos in a chaos warband, and one is rewarded for such a feat of arms? Toiletry? I'm not really sure. Anywho, if one is to be rewarded for this action with some form of boon, say for example a mutation that would raise your status within the warband, but everyone around you would also think, oh great, another competitor, I've already got enough of those, let's see if we can trim down the numbers a wee bit. And of course, this threat does not only come from your immediate comrades on the same social strata. In fact, it comes down even harder from up above. If, let's say, a Khorne warlord decides that one of his subordinates is getting a little bit too ambitious, he may send him off on an impossible task, where the subordinate would either die in attempting to carry out some kind of nonsense like swimming up the Niagara Falls or leaping off a great cliff and surviving, complete and utter nonsense like that, and if the subordinate protests, the Cornet Lord simply kills him, stating that he clearly did not believe enough in the ruinous powers. If he comes back having failed, the Cornet Lord will also kill him for daring to return his task unfinished. There is a wide variety of exceedingly unreasonable things a jealous warlord might order his subordinates to do, and the only real protection you have against being sent off on one of these suicidal tasks is A. Remain as unnoticeable as possible, blending into the background while trying to build your own power base in best Tzeentchian fashion, or B. Making yourself utterly and completely undispensable to the warlord. Now, this is a particularly dangerous decision because this means you have to step out into the limelight. You have to make yourself a target by stepping out into the limelight and saying, "Hey, look at me, I am awesome. I can pull off all of this shit and I never goddamn fail. That is why you cannot kill me, because you want the favor of the gods, and I can make that happen." Of course, this is one hell of a tightrope, because the moment you get a little bit too useful, you're gonna get killed. And the moment you get a little bit too useless, you're also going to get killed. And, of course, you're also going to have to fight off literal hordes of haters who all want your spot. But if by some miracle our little Norscan exile makes his way through all of these various challenges, he may eventually one day come to lead a warband of his very own, and warbands, generally speaking, are claimed from other warlords. Of course, there is the occasional exceptions where a particularly powerful champion starts out as particularly powerful and creates his own warband, but this is extremely rare, and usually only happens in the case of some higher up in established society deciding to try and go his own way, or an outcast from certain other societies, which may simply have no other choice but to start his own quote-unquote warband, but we'll get to that. An example of this may, for example, be an earl's son who decides, okay, you know what, I don't want to be my daddy's little butt boy. I don't want to take over his raiding business. I'm going to go and be a demon prince of Slaanesh because I am very fond of putting my winky into warm and soft things. And he may therefore be able to convince a portion of his tribe to go, you know what, this'll be way more fun than whaling or raiding up and down the coast. We'll go on a massive, hilarious orgy party, all of us. And therefore he'll start with a group of willing volunteers right off the bat. But this is, of course, as mentioned, very, very rare, as most earls' sons will prefer to go the safe route. Becoming the next earl is a hell of a lot easier and probably a hell of a lot more comfortable than leaving your village for the road and attempting to become some form of a chaos prince. As for how one can take over a warband, there is of course the most direct approach by simply killing your predecessor. The most oft-favoured approach, certainly. Or, of course, if one is a follower of some other deity like Tzeentch, it might be through plotting. It would certainly give you a much better chance of getting noticed by your chosen deity if you dethrone your predecessor via some lengthy, intricate plot. Khorne would, of course, frown upon that. He would far more favour the direct approach. There might be other ways as well. For example, fucking your superior to death in the case of Slaanesh. I'm not entirely sure of the logistics of that operation, but I'm sure you could do it somehow via creative means of penetration. Actually, you know what? Let's not dwell too long on this before YouTube demonetizes me, shall we? Or one may also inherit the warband. Say that your boss man has been doing really, really well recently, and has been granted the ultimate reward, demonhood. He ascends and leaves his mantle to his favoured subordinate. It's probably the least usual way of somebody climbing to the top of a warband, but it does happen, although in many cases this is almost seen as a bad omen for his successor, as being handed something very rarely has any value in Chaos Society. And of course, just to make it clear, I use the term warband here because it's the most common. The violent route is by far the most usual one, but there are of course other forms of warbands as well, like cults, for example, in civilized societies, or covenants of magis conspiring to cast great rituals, or secret pleasure palaces that travel around in virtual circuses, in some case literal circuses, or other various covens, etc. So, now that our brave Norscan exile has finally risen to the top of his warband, where does he go from here? Because, of course, merely becoming the leader of a warband is nowhere near a great enough feat to truly draw the attention of the ruinous powers. No. The Chaos Gods expect a lot more from their favoured servants than that. Our aspiring warlord essentially has to craft himself a resume, as no single act is likely to be anywhere near grand enough. A lifetime of service is required to even hope for the ultimate reward of demonhood. And along the way, the gods will send him various challenges, various boons, weapons, armor, mutations, followers, influence, or demonic pets of various types. In many cases, the acquiring of these items or allies may be considered tests, like finding a magic sword guarded by a two-headed dragon, for example, or subduing a particularly vile and vicious demonic entity to ride into battle, mayhaps. Or it could be a far more lengthy quest-style thing. Go over there, do this, achieve that, steal this, bring me that, etc., etc. The Chaos equivalent of a FedEx quest. You know, the more I think about this would make an awesome video game, wouldn't it? Imagine something along the lines of Mount & Blade, with a far more intricate political and RPG system, where you have to raise through the ranks, gain boons of magic weapons, etc., and be granted quests by other cult leaders, warbands, and potentially even the gods. It'd be pretty damn fun. Anywho, back to the subject at hand. An aspiring champion will be expected to carry out many such tasks, until he is essentially completely and utterly bedecked in various boons of chaos, a full suit of chaos armor, a magic weapon or two, perhaps a magic shield, a demonic steed, an advisory demon, some sorcerer's amulet to protect him from magic, maybe a collar of corn, all kinds of things. A successful Chaos Champion is a literal walking arsenal, which is so far set apart from baseline humanity that he may as well be some entirely different species. And I mean that in the most literal sense. A Chaos Champion can have all kinds of boons, granting him extra strength, speed, resilience. There are Chaos Champions of Nurgles that have eaten literal cannonballs to the chest and walked away with nothing but a mild tummy ache. However, this, of course, is still no guarantee. There are those that have served the Chaos Gods their entire lives, having heaped accolades and achievements upon accolades and achievement, striving for ever greater heights, and yet has never received so much as a single moment of notice from their patron deity. Indeed, they may even decide to reward some completely different individual within the champion's warband for, again, apparently no goddamn reason. So, how does one get around this? If one can spend literally one's entire life serving the gods, and yet you are still not guaranteed any actual reward, how does one get around it? Well, there is no sure thing in Chaos, ever, but one can increase one's own odds, and the easiest way in which to do so is to ensure that you are closer to the gods you are trying to impress. And fortunately, there is a location within the Warhammer world that is absolutely perfect for this. The cold, hard, extreme north, where the Old One's warp gate lies shattered and broken, pouring the stuff of chaos into the Warhammer world. In this place, the real world and the immaterium are as close as they can possibly get, and therefore any action carried out in this environment is worth, oh, so much more than 100 actions carried out in the softer lands to the south. And on that note, now that we've talked about our little barbarian fella, let's look at the opposite example. What if somebody wished to follow the path of the Chaos Gods, but you were not born in Norska, you were not born hung, you were born in the Empire, or Bretonia, or Estalia, or Tilea? How then would one go about gaining the favour of the gods? Because surely they frown upon soft southerners, right? Wrong. In fact, some of the Chaos Gods' most favoured servants are those very same soft southerners. Because, as mentioned previously, Chaos sees no value in anything that is given or granted, and if you are born in the north and raised to worship the Chaos Gods, to serve them your whole life, well, that's just not as interesting. Your choice to serve the Chaos Gods then is almost a certainty, isn't it? That's not interesting, that's not fun, that's not cool. A southerner, however, raised to despise anything that has to do with chaos and indoctrinated into their soft southern religions, if such an individual turns to chaos, ooh, that's a whole lot more interesting. Though, don't make the mistake of thinking this is in any way easier. In fact, the gods may like it more simply because it's a hell of a lot harder. In Norscan society, or Hung, or any other chaos-infested society, trying to become a champion of the ruinous gods is, as mentioned, not frowned upon at all. It is seen as a very honourable and good thing to attempt to do. In the Empire, or Bretonia, such ambitions are likely to get you executed in a most deliberate, slow, and painful fashion, usually after lengthy and excruciating torture. All of this means that if one wishes to avoid eventual death after lengthy torture, one needs to behave oneself in a very different fashion in the south than one could in the north. There are no war bands in the south, or, well, there are, but not in the same way. Chaos warbands in the north are free to go pretty much whatever they want. Of course, they're still limited by the need to find food and plunder, etc., and they're going to have to fight off some hostile tribes in all due likelihood. But if a warband was to appear in the Empire, for example, and it made itself obvious, it would very quickly attract the attention of the local lord, and all manners of hell would be brought down upon them. Warbands that do exist within the borders of the Empire do so by stealth, by hiding out in the forests with the goblins and the beastmen and avoiding general notice, or, if they are noticed, by leaving as quickly as possible, as they have very little in the way of chance at fighting off a lord's retinue. And this kind of an existence grants very little in the way of opportunity to get the attention of the Chaos Gods. Fleeing and hiding in bushes is not exactly the kind of things that impress Khorne. No, to really build a successful career within Chaos in the South, one needs to be a little bit more subtle. One can certainly include warbands in the forest in one's plan, but it's far more about a web of intrigue, building a secret society, a cult for example, and then forging alliances with small warbands in the forest, political groupings, getting members of the cult into important positions to grant further favours to the cult. Some of these cults even act more or less out in the open, as there is no official state religion in the Empire. Of course, they don't market themselves as chaos cults, obviously, but they may say that they worship a certain deity, for example, like the Knightly Order of the Blazing Sun, which has been suspected of all manners of wrongdoing for a while, as they of course worship a foreign deity in the form of Myrmidia, but they have, over the hundreds of years convinced the Empire that they are a loyal order and that Myrmidia is a wholesome deity. As long as a cult can convince wider society of the same thing, they are free to operate relatively in the open. Of course, they still want to keep a certain degree of subtlety in case witch hunters come knocking on the door, but assuming they can act in secret, they can carry out fairly brazen maneuvers in the Empire. It's considerably more difficult in Bretonnia, but in high and noble society there is also still ways and means to form a cult. Perhaps in the form of some warrior lodge, for example, where only the finest of knights go to train, and maybe once they are there they are introduced to some tips and tricks if one were to offer up a certain prayer, for example, to an entirely harmless deity, mind you. They don't mention corn outright, but maybe a certain less known battle deity of the far south or the far east, perhaps. Corn in disguise, obviously. Then they would be rewarded with greater prowess. And if the chief fencing master of the school is absolutely amazing, which a blessing or two from Corn might certainly achieve, then it would undoubtedly attract quite the attention of the local nobles. But, of course, that is also a different challenge. Let us say that you are blessed by the attention of the Chaos Gods as a cult master of a southern cabal. Let's, for example, say that you are a leader of a Slaneshi cult, and Slanesh decides to bless you with the gift of beauty. You look like Michelangelo's David. You're absolutely perfect, but your skin has taken on a strange, unhealthy-looking pallor, to the point where your blue blood vessels are standing out against your skin. As long as you can, cover it up a little bit with gloves, perhaps, or keep yourself in poor lighting, all of it can easily be overlooked, and all that remains is your perfect physique, but it might severely limit you operating out in the open, as you would stand out quite a bit. And there are, of course, mutations that are far more difficult to hide, like legs that bend the wrong way, or googly eyes, or certain Nurgle blessings. A preposterous gut might be something you can hide or excuse for a while, but when your innards start falling out and you start smelling like a corpse, well, impossible to hide? Maybe not, but certainly a challenge for your local perfume supplier. This is then obviously a bit of a challenge. The more successful you become, the more rewards you will gather. The more rewards you gather, the more difficult it will be to act out in the open. The harder it will be to act out in the open, the more power you're going to have to delegate. And just like in the warbands in the north, the southern cults and warbands will be equally cutthroat. A leader that is no longer able to operate out into the open and gain the confidence of his followers will quickly find himself at the wrong end of his own cult. And of course, if he does operate in public, it is almost certainly going to draw the eyes of the witch hunters, which isn't much better. In fact, it would probably be even worse than the other alternative. This means that most cult leaders in the south will have to do one out of two things. Either they will have to go deep underground and essentially act like a fully illegal criminal organization, hiding from the law, hiding out in sewers in the deep dark forest, whilst attempting to pull the strings from hiding, influencing occasional politicians, etc. But the problem is, once one of these cults is revealed, the witch hunters and local lords tend to have rather vested interests in ensuring that they are plucked rather thoroughly. And very, very, very few cults indeed ever truly survive being discovered. The other possibility is that the cult leader will eventually decide to go north. Maybe he has received some sort of message from his god, for example. If you wish to continue on your path, you need to venture northwards. Maybe he has been granted a quest or a vision. Go here, find a magical blade, continue your journey, that kind of stuff. And this pilgrimage north can take quite a few different shapes. For example, a leader of a large affluent cult that hasn't really been discovered yet could swing quite a lot of funds, might even be able to bring along a large quantity of followers and essentially form a warband as they head up north. How long a warband of relatively soft southerners will survive up north, well, that depends a lot on the preparations of their leader, but certainly they will be far better out than the average outcast from a Norscan village. Alternatively, they could not have a large cult to draw upon, or they could have been discovered and essentially they are now fleeing northwards. This is also possible. In which case, depending on the nature of their blessing, they may be far better off than the average Norscan thrown out of his village, or he may even be considerably worse off. Even if you have a physique like David and an attitude perfect for southern ballrooms, it isn't really going to help you all that much in the cold, harsh north, and being dressed and acting like a southerner is in all due likelihood going to get you treated rather roughly by the locals. But of course, again, that is exactly also your advantage. As a southern rebel, you'll stand out more in the eyes of the Chaos Gods because everything will be against you. Whether or not that is all that much of a comfort, well, it depends, really. But the gods are very fond of rebels, those who break the mold and go against the flow. If a southerner manages to make it in the Chaos Waste and perhaps even heading all the way up north near the Broken Webway Gate, they are almost sure to get the attention of their patron deity. Of course, the odds of them actually getting all the way up north are virtually nil, but still, there is a chance, however slight. And at the end of the day, the journey towards becoming a Chaos Champion or a Demon Prince is already a game of extraordinarily slight chances. 1 in a million will become a Chaos Champion, but only 1 in a billion will ever reach the dizzying heights of demonhood. So, anybody considering a career change, perhaps? I mean, the rewards are considerable. Strength, beauty, wisdom, immortality, and endless hedonistic orgies, if you choose to follow a certain deity. But personally, I would place considerably better odds on winning the lottery. So, until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.